65%, 2 out of every 3 people you know. 2 out of 3 viewers of this video would have pulled the final lever. A sterile laboratory at a prestigious university. A man in a white lab coat, and you in the role of the teacher in front of a shock generator. From the next room, you hear screams of pain. With each press of the lever, they grow more desperate. But the calm, insistent voice of the experimenter repeats, "The experiment requires that you continue." What makes ordinary people, not sadists, ignore their own conscience and continue to inflict pain, reaching the 450-volt mark? That's twice the voltage labeled "Danger, Severe Shock" on the control panel. In 3 minutes, you will learn how one innocent lie at the very beginning of the experiment created a psychological trap that was nearly impossible to escape. But here's the first paradox. Why did the participants who argued the loudest, sweated, and agonized the most end up reaching the fatal mark more often than those who obeyed in silence? Their protest was not a sign of resistance, but something entirely different. And the second paradox, how did a simple change of scenery, moving the experiment from a prestigious Yale laboratory to a modest rented office, lower the level of obedience yet still leave it at a shocking rate of nearly 50%? What exactly within the university walls held such power over conscience? This is more than just a story about an experiment. By the end of this investigation, you will have 7 keys to the code of obedience, 7 psychological mechanisms that Milgram uncovered one by one. By understanding them, you will gain a tool to protect yourself from manipulation in your own life. We will find the answer to the first paradox about the suffering yet obedient participants in the 5th section, when we dissect the experiment's core mechanism, the agentic state. But to understand this mechanism, we must go back to the very beginning, to the first innocent lie that set the entire machine of obedience in motion. No one agreed to an experiment called "Test How Cruel You Are." People came for $4 to participate in a study on memory. They were met in a prestigious laboratory at Yale University. An authoritative scientist in a white lab coat spoke of their contribution to science. A rigged drawing randomly assigned the participant to be the teacher. All of this created an illusion of legitimacy, and the person voluntarily accepted the obligation. Milgram didn't force them to swim against the current of their conscience. He dug a small, scientific channel into which their conscience willingly diverted. Now, refusal was not just stopping an action, it was sabotaging an important study. Then came the second step, the calibration of cruelty. The teacher was invited to experience a shock himself, 45 volts. Participants described it as a sharp sting, like a large insect bite. Real enough to be believable, but not painful enough to be frightening. This honest gesture was a key manipulation. Its purpose was not empathy, but the normalization of violence. It created a false sense of control, masking the real escalation of pain. This physical sensation remained in their memory as the benchmark for a harmless punishment. Can you recall a time when a small concession at the beginning led you to do something you would have never agreed to outright? Why didn't dozens of educated people see the deception? The setup was flawless. Scientific jargon, the complex appearance of the generator, the calm demeanor of the experimenter. Everything worked to create an impenetrable aura of legitimacy. Before starting, Milgram surveyed 40 psychiatrists from a leading medical school. Their prediction, only 1 in 1,000, a pathological sadist, would go to the maximum voltage. The reality was 65%, a difference of 650 times. It was as if meteorologists had predicted light breeze and a Category 5 hurricane hit the city. The setup created the stage, but the main actor on it was the silent machine, designed as the perfect instrument of obedience. Milgram's genius lay not in the power of the command, but in his understanding of the psychology of gradual commitment. He created what is known as a slippery slope. He didn't ask participants to kill immediately. He asked them to press a button delivering a negligible 15-volt shock, an action almost anyone would agree to. Each subsequent step seemed so close to the previous one. This principle works like a flour sifter. The first press goes through the mesh easily. Each next one is just as insignificant, but eventually the entire pile is sifted through. This principle was physically embodied in the shock generator, 30 neat levers, lined up like steps on a ladder from a harmless 15-volt click to the deafening silence after 450 volts. How exactly the machine ensured this fatal transition will be examined in the next section. 30 levers, each added 15 volts. This small increment created a trap of consistency. Having administered a 150-volt shock and heard a scream, the participant had already made a moral compromise. To avoid seeing himself as a bad person, he had to justify the action. It's for science. But if 150 volts are justified, why not 165? The difference is negligible. To refuse now would be to admit that the previous 10 shocks were a cruel mistake. Archival recordings preserve this sound, a dry, mechanical click that became the soundtrack to the surrender of conscience. But the machine itself was silent. The real poison that paralyzed the will was contained in words. It would seem the labels on the panel should have stopped anyone. The scale was marked slight shock, moderate shock, danger, severe shock, and 2 ominous XXX marks after 435 volts. But reality shatters this logic. More than 2/3 of participants ignored the danger warning, pressing the levers 6 more times after it appeared. This proves that in a high-pressure situation, our brain prioritizes social cues over objective information. The calm, confident voice of the experimenter saying, "Please continue," was a more compelling argument to the psyche than a red warning label right in front of their eyes. But this voice was not just calm. It used carefully crafted phrases designed to systematically remove responsibility. The turning point came at 150 volts. Before this, the learner only grunted. Now he shouted, "Get me out of here. I have a heart condition. I refuse to go on." In that second, the abstract exercise turned into the real infliction of suffering. Conscience screamed, "Stop," while the obligation to the scientist demanded, "Continue." According to participants' testimonies, the silence in the lab between the scream and the decision became heavy, an almost physical weight on their shoulders. The person would sweat. Their hands would tremble. They would look at the experimenter seeking permission to stop. At the moment conscience was ready to win, the experimenter would utter the first of 4 will-paralyzing phrases. Imagine yourself in the participant's place. You have already administered a 195-volt shock. Desperate screams are coming from behind the wall. You hesitate. Of course, you should stop. But by this point, you have already pressed the lever 13 times. You have committed 13 conscious, immoral acts in the last 20 minutes. The psychology of sunk cost weighs on you. If you stop now, you will have to admit that everything you did before was senseless cruelty. It is easier to continue to justify the past. And it is precisely in this moment of doubt, as your hand hovers over the next lever, that the scientist utters one of the phrases. We will analyze these 4 phrases, the next element in the arsenal of obedience, word for word in the next section. The voice of authority used 4 stages of verbal pressure. In response to the participants' first doubts, the experimenter delivered the first phrase, "Please continue." This was a polite request, appealing to social norms and the voluntary commitment. A gentle yet firm reminder of the contract. If the participant continued to object, the second phrase was used, "The experiment requires that you continue." Here, the request changes to an impersonal demand. Responsibility shifts from the experimenter to the abstract concept of science. The first phrase was a hand gently pushing you forward. The second is an impersonal weight that settles on your shoulders, compelling you to move. But what if the appeal to science also failed? Milgram had the next, more powerful verbal blow ready. The third phrase raised the stakes. It is absolutely essential that you continue. It left no room for discussion, framing the participants' actions as critically important. But the real verbal knockout was delivered by the final 4th stage. If the participant still resisted, the experimenter would state, "You have no other choice, you must go on." This was a blatant lie. There was always a choice. The participant could get up and leave at any moment. But this phrase, spoken by a man in a white lab coat within the walls of Yale University, became a reality for the psyche. Participants clung to it in interviews. "I was told I had no choice." Milgram called this state, where a person ceases to feel responsible for their actions, the agentic state. Its unveiling awaits us in the 5th section. These words did not work in a vacuum. They were spoken in a calm, confident, monotonous voice. This emotionless tone created an impression of objective, undeniable necessity. It was the will of the system, not the command of a tyrant. But remove just one component, and the magic of the words vanished. In one variation of the experiment, the scientist left the room and gave the same orders over the phone. The result was staggering. The rate of full obedience dropped from 65% to just 21%. 2 out of 3 previously obedient individuals found the strength to rebel. Some even began to lie, saying they were continuing while actually pressing the weakest levers. The physical presence of authority was critical. The words were merely the key that turned in the lock of the mind, opening the door to a special state. What happens in your mind when you hear, "You have no other choice," even though you know it's a lie? You desperately want to believe it. In a situation of unbearable moral stress, this phrase is a life raft. It offers a simple way out. Stop being responsible and become merely an instrument. The person underwent a genuine psychological shift from an autonomous state, where they act on their own will, to an agentic state, where they see themselves only as a tool. This shift is like water freezing. Under the pressure of authority, as if exposed to frost, a person freezes, turning into ice, solid, and acting according to the laws of an external system. Their conscience doesn't disappear, it is simply shackled. How this state works, why it is so dangerous, and how to recognize it in yourself, we will delve into this in the next central section of our investigation. Here is the paradox that breaks all intuitive logic. The participants who argued the loudest, sweated, and agonized the most were more likely to reach the fatal mark. Their visible suffering was not a sign of resistance, but a symptom of successful obedience. Milgram explained it this way: in a hierarchy, a person switches from an autonomous state, where they are responsible for their actions, to an agentic state. In this state, they see themselves merely as an instrument, and the primary virtue becomes the competent execution of an order. Analysis of audio recordings showed that the more a participant objected, the higher the probability they would go all the way to 450 volts. Their verbal protest was a valve to release moral tension. They appeased their conscience with words, which allowed their hands to continue pressing the levers. The audio archives preserve these moments. A trembling voice says, "I can't do this," followed immediately by the dry click of the next shock after the experimenter's prompt. But was there a moment when this switch became irreversible? In the agentic state, a substitution occurs. Consciousness narrows like the focus of a camera lens. It concentrates on the minor technical task, while the enormous moral consequence blurs into the background. The participant began to worry not about the screams from the next room, but about the experimenter being displeased with them. The question, "What am I doing?" was replaced with, "Am I doing my job well?" This professional ethic, the desire to be a good subject, completely displaced universal human morality. One participant said after the experiment, "I wanted to help him, that scientist. He seemed so dedicated." He wanted to be a good assistant, even if it meant being a bad person. Have you ever carried out a questionable directive at work, reassuring yourself with the thought, "It's just a job"? This mechanism is not a laboratory artifact. It is a real psychological shift that Milgram began studying to understand the psychology of the Holocaust. His research was influenced by the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, calmly stated that he felt no hatred toward Jews. His only fault, he claimed, was obedience and the efficient execution of his job organizing transports. The agentic state is not the absence of morality, but its perverse replacement. Morality becomes loyalty to the system. As Hannah Arendt wrote, "This is the banality of evil." It is committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who stop thinking and simply do their jobs. In Milgram's experiment, there was a clear dividing line after which most could no longer turn back. This psychological switch was flipped by a combination of factors: the authority of Yale, the scientist's white coat, gradual commitment, and the paralyzing phrases. But over dozens of variations, one point of no return emerged. The moment when the internal conflict peaked, and the participant either quit the game or finally broke and went all the way. This moment occurred at 150 volts. It was at this level that the learner, for the first time, did not just scream in pain, but demanded to stop the experiment, directly challenging the authority. Statistics showed that about 80% of participants who crossed this threshold ultimately went to the very end of the scale. Why 150 volts became this Rubicon for the conscience, and what happened to those who crossed it, we will analyze in detail in the next section. 150 volts. Before this, there were only groans. Now from behind the wall comes the first real scream. "Get me out of here, I have a heart condition." The abstract game of memory ends in that instant. The real conscious infliction of pain begins. It seems obvious that here, in the face of unambiguous suffering, most should stop. But reality delivered a damning verdict. This mark was not a stop sign, but the primary filter of conscience. 79% of participants who pressed the next lever ultimately reached the fatal mark of 450 volts. Nearly 4 out of 5 who crossed this psychological Rubicon could not turn back. The real reason lay not in the voltage, but in the powerful mechanism of self-justification that was activated at precisely this moment. This mechanism is called cognitive dissonance. The psyche cannot tolerate the conflict between the belief, "I am a good person," and the action, "I am inflicting pain on an innocent man." To relieve this unbearable tension, something must be changed. One could change the action, get up and leave. But that would mean admitting that the previous 10 shocks were senseless cruelty. There is an easier path: change the belief. The participant began to actively convince himself, the scientist knows what he's doing. The suffering is exaggerated. This is necessary for science. As we already know, the louder the participant argued, the more certain he was to go to the end. His protest was not resistance, but a valve for releasing moral pressure, allowing his hands to continue their work. And this new reality, convenient for the conscience, became even more terrifying when the victim suddenly fell silent. What's more terrifying than screams? Silence. After 300 volts, the learner stopped responding. On the archival recordings, you can hear participants begin to cough nervously in the ensuing silence. Their breathing becomes heavy. They filled this vacuum with their worst assumptions. He's unconscious. He's having a heart attack. He's dead. It would seem this deathly silence should have been the final irrefutable argument to stop. But by this point, the mechanism of self-justification and responsibility shifting was already operating at full capacity. In this frightening uncertainty, the calm voice of the experimenter became the only guide, a beacon that said, "Everything is fine, please continue." But what if this beacon was moved from a prestigious university to an ordinary office? Could a simple change of scenery alter this outcome? Logic suggests not, as the internal mechanisms of the psyche remain the same. But Milgram conducted the experiment in a modest rented office in a neighboring city, and the rate of full obedience dropped from 65 to 48%. This proves that our behavior is a product of the interaction between personality and situation. The walls of Yale University conveyed reliability, scientific legitimacy, and removed a portion of the responsibility. When these authoritative walls disappeared, participants had to bear more of the moral burden. This dependence on the setting became the next element in the arsenal of obedience that Milgram uncovered. In a moment, you will learn by what percentage obedience drops when you simply take the white lab coat off the experimenter. How could a simple move of the experiment from Yale to a modest office, under the sign of a fictional firm, Research Associates of Bridgeport, reduce the willingness to inflict pain by nearly 20%? The participants were the same, the procedure was the same. Only the walls had changed. This is the sixth element of the code of obedience, the power of context. Within the university walls, 65% showed full obedience. But even when that prestige vanished, when the authority became tarnished, 47.5% of participants still went to the end, almost half. This proved that it wasn't just about the walls, but also about the symbols people wear. And the chief among these symbols is the white lab coat. Our brain uses mental shortcuts to save energy. Yale equals science, trust, safety. A modest office equals doubt, risk. Symbols of authority act like a riverbed. Our consciousness, like water, automatically flows along this established path because it is easier than forging a new one. Milgram tested this by removing the main symbol. In one variation, the experimenter wore ordinary clothes. The result, the obedience level dropped sharply again. We obey not the person, but the construct. The participants were not obeying John Williams, but the function of scientist, which consisted of a lab coat, university walls, and stern phrases. But there was one factor that could shatter this construct: physical proximity to the victim. What changes if the learner is not screaming from behind a wall but is sitting in the same room as you? In the standard version of the experiment, the wall created psychological distance, allowing one to detach from the consequences. But when Milgram removed the wall and placed the learner nearby, obedience dropped from 65 to 40%. And when the teacher had to physically force the victim's hand onto the electrode, only 30% went to the end. Physical proximity to suffering is a powerful antidote to blind obedience. It shatters the agentic state, making the connection between your action and another's pain undeniable. But there was one factor that caused obedience to plummet to almost zero, and it had nothing to do with the victim. What is stronger, the vertical pressure of authority or the horizontal support of an ally? Until now, Milgram's system had brilliantly isolated the participant, leaving them one-on-one with power. The experimenter was the sole source of social reality, creating a psychological tunnel. But in one variation, Milgram destroyed this tunnel. He introduced two other teachers into the room, actors who refused to obey at a certain point. This twist was aimed at the very heart of the obedience mechanism, at its Achilles heel. How exactly did two people saying no manage to demolish the obedience statistics? The culmination of the investigation is in the next section: the introduction of just one dissenting person into the room. This is the seventh and most powerful element of the code of obedience: the spark of rebellion. Two actors also playing teachers were seated in the room with the real participant. It would seem the pressure should have only increased, but at 150 volts, the first actor decisively refused to continue. At 210 volts, the second followed his example. The real participant was left alone with the scientist, but now he had a precedent. The result was staggering. The rate of full obedience plummeted from 65 to a shocking 10%. This was the most dramatic drop in all 18 variations of the experiment. The decrease was 6 times more effective than physical proximity to the victim. How did the example of two ordinary people prove stronger than the command of a scientist from Yale? The rebellion of allies shatters the illusion of unanimity. As long as the participant was alone, his doubt seemed like a personal weakness, a deviation from the norm. But the example of another person provides social permission to rebel. It doesn't just show that one can say no. It screams, "Your doubts are normal. You are right." This instantly legitimizes the internal protest and removes the burden of being the first to break the rules. Authority created an invisible weight pressing on the shoulders. The rebel didn't remove this weight, but he stood beside you and showed that you could stand up straight under this pressure. The first rebel creates a small crack in the monolithic dam of authority, which instantly shatters the entire structure. What happened when the nightmare ended? The experimenter conducted a debriefing. He revealed that the learner was an actor, no shocks had been delivered, and he arranged for them to meet. But the reality was more complex than simple relief. The participants' reactions were a mixture of immense relief and deep, acute shame. They couldn't believe what they had just been capable of. Milgram was not studying cruelty. His goal was not to prove that people are evil, but to show how good people do bad things under the pressure of a system. In his reports, he noted that many participants, after the reveal, couldn't let go of the actor-learner's hand for a long time, as if seeking physical confirmation that no harm was done. So we have uncovered the 7 mechanisms of the code of obedience. We've seen the deception, the machine of pain, the 4 phrases, the agentic state, the point of no return, the power of context, and finally, the spark of rebellion. But this is not just a set of psychological tricks from the past. These are universal tools used to manipulate us every day: the slippery slope in sales, the power of context in office design, authority in advertising. The Milgram experiment is not a story, it's a mirror. Now that we know how this mechanism is constructed, we can put it all together and understand what it truly says about each of us. To understand why this system worked, one must see its architecture. The first three elements, deception, gradualism, and verbal pressure, built its foundation. The deceptive setup created a legitimate stage on which a person voluntarily accepted an obligation. The pain machine, with its 15-volt increments, turned the path to cruelty into a gentle, slippery slope where each next step seemed insignificant. And the experimenter's 4 phrases acted as a barrier, suppressing the first, weakest attempts of conscience to resist. This triple combination lured the participant into a trap. By the time their doubts became truly serious, they were already too deeply involved. The psychological cost of backing out had become prohibitively high. This solid foundation created the perfect conditions for activating the system's main engine. If the first 3 elements were the foundation of the trap, the next 3 were its working engine. On this base, the agentic state was activated, a psychological shift that absolved the person of responsibility. The 150-volt threshold became its point of irreversible engagement, where the mechanism of cognitive dissonance forced the justification of cruelty already committed. And the power of context, the walls of Yale and the scientist's white lab coat, served as the fuel that sustained this state, preventing it from shutting down. The first trio of elements worked on the external situation. The second trio worked within the person's mind. It was an assault on the conscience from 2 directions simultaneously, from the outside and from within. This 6-element system seems perfect and invulnerable. It explains how ordinary people become perpetrators, but it had one critical vulnerability. Now we can answer the main question: why were 65% of ordinary people willing to administer a fatal electric shock? Not because they were sadists, but because they were isolated within a 6-component system of psychological pressure that proved stronger than their individual will. The experiment revealed not the evil in people, but the power of the situation. And the 7th element, the spark of rebellion, became the universal antidote. The example of just one dissenting person shattered the isolation and broke the legitimacy of authority, bringing the entire structure down. This proves its vulnerability. Knowing these 7 mechanisms is an inoculation against manipulation. Awareness of how the system works is the first step toward resistance. The primary enemy is not authority, but unawareness. The Milgram experiment is a mirror. Throughout this investigation, we have been looking at others, at those participants from the 60s. Now it is time to look into this mirror ourselves. After everything you have learned about the 7 mechanisms of obedience, the power of the situation, and the point of no return, answer one question honestly, primarily for yourself. If you were in that room, would you have obeyed or rebelled? I am not asking for a long explanation. Just write one of these 2 words in the comments right now: obeyed or rebelled. Your answer is not a boast or a confession. It is a declaration, a reminder to yourself of which side you are on. It is the most important answer you will give today.